The thing about sleeping in your truck in a Canadian Tire parking lot in November is that you learn very quickly which sleeping bag is rated for what temperature, and you learn that the one you grabbed from your garage in a hurry on your way out the door is not rated for what the thermometer says at 2 in the morning in Sudbury, Ontario. I had a toque pulled down over my ears and I was still cold. 43 years old, a plumber's license I'd held for 19 years, and I was lying in the back seat of my 2018 F-150 with my knees bent because I'm 6'1", and the truck wasn't built for sleeping, and I was trying to remember the last time I'd felt warm. The knock on the window came at 2:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been watching the clock on my phone, doing the math on how many hours until the Canadian Tire opened and I could go inside and pretend to browse and stand near the heating vents. I sat up, OPP cruiser parked behind me, lights off. The officer had a flashlight pointed at my window. I lowered the glass. "Everything okay, sir?" I told him yes. I told him I'd driven up from Barrie and got tired. I told him I pulled over to rest. None of that was entirely a lie except the part about Barrie. I hadn't been in Barrie in 4 months. He asked for my license and registration. I handed them over without thinking much about it. I'd been checked rest stops, once in a Walmart lot in Espanola. Nothing ever came of it. You hand over your documents, they run your name, they tell you to get somewhere safer, and they move on. This time he walked back to his cruiser and he was gone a long time. Long enough that I started thinking about whether I'd renewed my registration, long enough that I started rehearsing what I would say if he asked me to step out, long enough that I'd talked myself into and out of 4 different versions of my situation. When he came back, he wasn't alone. There was a second officer behind him, younger, hanging back a few steps. The first officer, his nameplate said Renault, leaned down to my window and looked at me carefully before he said anything. "Sir, I need to ask you something and I need you to stay calm." I said, "Okay, when I ran your information, something came up. There's a flag on your file, not a warrant, not a criminal flag." He paused. "A federal flag. RCMP. It's been sitting on your file for a long time." I said, "I don't understand." He said, "Neither did we, so we called it in." He held my license up so I could see it in the beam of his flashlight. "Is this your name?" I looked at it. Reed Callahan. My name. The name on my plumber's license, my SIN card, my passport, my truck registration, my mortgage that I no longer had any claim to. "Yes," I said. "That's my name." He looked at me for a moment. "The flag says otherwise. I should tell you about my father-in-law first, because that's where a lot of this starts, even if I didn't understand that until much later. His name was Douglas Fairweather, Doug. He was a third-generation property developer in northern Ontario, the kind of man who had his name on the side of a building in downtown Sudbury, and who considered that a form of biography. He had 3 daughters, a membership at the Timberwolf Golf Club, and an opinion about every single thing that happened in a 5-kilometer radius of his house. His middle daughter was Fiona Fairweather, which is a name that sounds like it was invented for a woman who was born to marry someone with a last name that sounded better, and Douglas had very specific ideas about what that last name should be. It should belong to someone in finance or law, or at the very minimum, someone who had attended a university that Douglas recognized. He did not recognize plumbers. I met Fiona at a job site. I know how that sounds. I was doing rough-in work for a new residential build-out past Lively, and she was doing the interior design consultation for the developer, and we ended up at the same Tim Hortons on a Thursday afternoon because it was the only Tim Hortons for 12 kilometers and we were both desperate for coffee. We talked for 2 hours. I drove home thinking about her for the rest of the night. We dated for 8 months before she brought me home to meet her parents. I remember Douglas looking at me across the dinner table the way you look at a scratch on a new car, not catastrophic, just something that shouldn't be there. "So you're a plumber," he said, and the way he said it, you would have thought he was saying, "So you collect roadkill." I told him I owned my own company. 4 trucks, 6 employees, contracts with 2 school boards and a hospital. I was proud of that. I'd built it from a one-man operation in my mid-20s with a used van and a second-hand pipe cutter. He nodded slowly like he was being very patient with me. "Fiona has a certain standard of living," he said. "I want to make sure she's able to maintain that." I said, "I think she's capable of deciding what her standard of living is." That was the wrong answer. I know that now. At the time I thought I was being respectful of his daughter. What he heard was a challenge to his authority, and Douglas Fairweather had not built a career in Northern Ontario property development by letting challenges go unanswered. Fiona and I got married the following spring in a ceremony at a lodge outside of Killarney that her parents paid for and that I was not allowed to have any input into. My mother flew in from Halifax. My side of the church was smaller than her side. Douglas noticed. For the first few years, things were manageable. Douglas was cold but civil. We had Christmas at their house, and he would talk to me about hockey or the weather, which were the 2 subjects he seemed to believe were appropriate for someone of my professional standing. I told myself it didn't matter. I had my company. I had Fiona. We had a house in a good neighborhood. We took a trip to Portugal the 2nd year we were married. Life was not bad. Then my company started growing faster than I'd expected. We landed a contract with a new commercial development Douglas had nothing to do with. Then another. Within 2 years, we had 12 employees and a fleet of 7 trucks. I hired a project manager and a dedicated estimator, and I started working with a commercial account at RBC that was larger than anything I'd managed before. Douglas found out about the commercial contract before I'd even had a chance to tell Fiona. I don't know how. He had connections everywhere. He called her before dinner one evening, and I could hear his voice through her phone from across the kitchen, this low-controlled anger that he always had when something happened that he hadn't approved of. What I didn't understand yet was that Douglas had believed all along that my success would be temporary, that I would plateau or stumble or simply bore Fiona into choosing someone more suitable. My continued growth wasn't a success story to him. It was a complication. Things changed after that call, subtly at first. A supplier I'd worked with for years suddenly had trouble filling our orders. A foreman I'd relied on for 6 years left without much explanation and showed up 2 weeks later working for a competitor who I knew had ties to Douglas's property group. A reference I'd provided for a school board tender apparently came back ambiguous, which had never happened before. I told myself it was coincidence. I told Fiona something felt wrong. She told me I was being paranoid, and she said it gently, the way she said things when she'd already discussed them with someone else first. The first time I understood what was actually happening was about 14 months before everything collapsed. I was reviewing our GST filings with our accountant, a woman named Joanne who had done our books since the beginning, and she found a discrepancy. Not large. $11,000 in expense claims she hadn't filed and couldn't trace back to any invoice she recognized. She thought it was a bookkeeping error. She started going back through the records. It wasn't a bookkeeping error. Fiona had signing authority on the business account. I had added her 3 years earlier when we were renovating the house, and I was traveling a lot, and it made sense for her to be able to handle things when I wasn't available. She had never used it for anything, as far as I knew. Joanne found $43,000 over 18 months. Small transfers, always under the threshold that would automatically flag, always to an account that didn't appear anywhere in our business records. It took another 3 weeks to trace that account to a numbered company registered to Douglas's group. I sat in my truck in our driveway for 40 minutes after Joanne called me with the final number. It was August hot, the windows down, and the neighbor's kid was riding a bike on the sidewalk, and I remember watching him and thinking how strange it was that the world was just continuing on, ordinary, while mine was falling through the floor. I went inside and I asked Fiona directly. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize either. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and she said, "You were never going to be what this family needed." She said it like she'd been thinking it for years and was relieved to finally say it out loud. "Dad just made sure the business wouldn't outlast the marriage." I said, "You stole from me." She said everything in that company was built with this family's support. I'm still not entirely sure what support she was referring to. Her parents had never given us a cent. I had built the company on a line of credit in 19-hour days, but I think in her version of events, Douglas having not destroyed me sooner counted as a form of generosity. The lawyers came next. I hired one, Douglas hired 3. The divorce was processed through a firm in Sudbury with an address on a street named after one of Douglas's developments, which I thought was a very neat piece of irony. By the end, I had my truck, my tools, my personal accounts, and a legal obligation to pay spousal support to a woman who had drained $43,000 from my business while I was working 70 hours a week to build it. The business was gone. Too much liability, too many creditors who'd been quietly primed by Douglas's network to call in their terms at the worst possible time. I shut it down in October. I paid everyone I could. I shook the hand of every employee and I drove away from our last job site with an empty trailer, and I didn't look back. I had nowhere to go that didn't feel like a defeat. My mother had a condo in Halifax that wasn't big enough for 2 people. My friends in Sudbury were awkward about it. Some of them had been Douglas's contacts too, which I hadn't appreciated until the divorce. I packed what fit in the back of the truck and I drove. I ended up in Northern Ontario because I knew the work. There was always plumbing work. I picked up cash jobs through word of mouth, enough to eat and put gas in the truck, not enough to rent anything in the winter. And that's how I ended up in a Canadian Tire parking lot in Sudbury at 2:47 a.m. talking to a man named Renaud about why my name was apparently not my name. He let me follow him to the detachment. Not under arrest, he was very clear about that. He said he needed to make some calls and it was too cold to do it in a parking lot. I sat in a chair beside a desk that had a photo of someone's kids on it and a half-eaten bag of bits and bites, and I drank bad coffee and I waited. It was almost 5 in the morning when a man came in who was not in uniform. He was around 60, heavy through the shoulders with a Stanfield shirt under an open fleece jacket. He sat down across from me. We were old acquaintances and put a manila envelope on the desk between us. He was federal, he said. He didn't specify further and nobody in the room asked him to. "Your name," he said, "is registered as Reed Callahan, yes?" I said yes. "Born in Kenora, Ontario, November 1981. I said yes. He opened the envelope and slid a single sheet across the desk. It was a photocopy of something. A birth certificate, I realized, but not mine. The name on it was Liam Arsenault, born Kenora, Ontario, November 1981. Same date as mine. Same date. Who is this? I asked. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral. That's the question we've been waiting a long time to answer, he said. We believe that's you. My father's name was Thomas Callahan. Tom. He was a licensed electrician who also did general contracting on the side, the kind of man who could fix almost anything and who approached problems with a quietness that I always admired and always tried to imitate. He died when I was 11. A construction site accident outside of Thunder Bay that I never heard the full details of because my mother, Helen, had a policy about not dwelling on things that couldn't be changed. She raised me on her own after that. We moved from Kenora to Barrie when I was 12, then to Halifax when I was 17 for her sister's health, and I stayed in Halifax through my apprenticeship before coming back to Ontario in my late 20s for the work. My mother died 3 years before my marriage fell apart. Breast cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end, which is its own story. What the federal officer told me in that detachment in Sudbury in the gray light of a November morning while I was tired and cold and had nothing left to lose was that Thomas Callahan was not my biological father. Not because my mother had been unfaithful, but because I was not originally named Reed Callahan at all. The man sitting across from me took his time. He'd clearly done this before or something like it. He told me that in the spring of 1987 a man named Gerald Arsenault, along with his wife and their 5-year-old son, entered a federal witness protection program in Ontario. Gerald Arsenault had been a bookkeeper for a company in northwestern Ontario that turned out to be the financial infrastructure for a trafficking operation that reached into 3 provinces. He had cooperated with federal investigators for 2 years before his testimony was needed in court. By the time it was over, the organization had dismantled. But before it did, 2 men who'd been named in the proceedings were killed, and Gerald Arsenault had been told in very clear terms that his name was known. The family was relocated, new identities. The boy, 5 years old, young enough, was registered as Reed Thomas Callahan. Thomas Callahan, listed as father on the new birth certificate, was a real person who had agreed to lend his identity to the cover, a distant cousin of my mother's who had no family of his own and who died the following year in circumstances that the officer described as unrelated. Helen Arsenault became Helen Callahan. She kept her first name because changing it caused complications she hadn't anticipated. Gerald Arsenault ceased to exist on paper, and the real Thomas Arsenault, my biological father, had agreed to separate from the family as an additional protective measure. It had been meant to be temporary. He would reestablish somewhere, build a new life, wait for contact when it was safe. I was looking at the officer. I was trying to understand what he was saying. "Where is he?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "We found him 8 months ago," he said. "He'd been living under a second name in Timmins for most of his adult life. He made one inquiry through a legal channel in 2019 trying to locate you through the program. It was flagged but not actioned fast enough." He paused. "He passed away in March. Pancreatic cancer. Very fast." I didn't say anything. "He left a package with his lawyer," the officer said. "Instructions to contact the program on his behalf when, if you were ever located." He'd been hoping for a long time. The lawyer's office was in Timmins. I drove there 3 days later after sleeping in a motel that the OPP detachment helped me find a rate for, because Officer Renault turned out to be a decent man who understood something about what it meant to discover the ground under your feet wasn't where you thought it was. The lawyer's name was Patrick Okafor, and his office was on a side street off Algonquin Boulevard and had a fiddle-leaf fig in the corner that was clearly struggling, and somehow that made me trust him more, because it meant he was human and not everything under his care flourished perfectly. He had a box for me, cardboard not large, sealed with packing tape that had gone dry and brittle around the edges. He left me alone in his meeting room with it. I sat there for a few minutes before I opened it. Inside, a photograph. My mother younger than I ever remember seeing her, standing beside a man I didn't recognize who had his arm around her shoulders and was laughing at something outside the frame. They looked relaxed, happy. The photo was taken somewhere in the summer, a lake behind them, birch trees, the particular blue of a northern Ontario sky. The man had my nose, I noticed that before anything else. My nose and something around the jaw. Below the photograph there were documents. Letters addressed to me that my mother had apparently given him when the program separated them, letters I'd written as a child in Kenora that I had absolutely no memory of writing, sealed and preserved. There were records, property documents, a registered account statement from a credit union in Timmins, and at the very bottom, a letter in handwriting I didn't recognize, dated 6 months before he died. "Reed, I have called you Reed in my head for 35 years, even though I've known that was never the name we chose for you. We had agreed on Liam. Your mother wanted Liam. I wanted to tell you that because I think names matter and you should know what yours was supposed to be. I'm not writing this to ask for your forgiveness. I gave up the right to that a long time ago, even if the reasons were ones I'd make again. What I want you to know is that I looked for you, not always through the right channels, and I understand now that I should have tried harder and earlier. I was afraid of bringing something dangerous closer to you again. That fear cost me things I can't get back. I know a little of what happened with your business and your marriage. I had a friend in Sudbury who knew your name. He didn't know the connection, but he mentioned you once and I kept track from there. I know what was done to you. I want you to know that what they took from you is nothing compared to what you built, and a man who builds from nothing once can build from nothing again. The account information in this box is yours. I worked for 30 years and I had nowhere to spend it except on myself, which I tried not to do too much of. It's not a fortune by some measures, by others it might be. I wanted to go to work for you. You have my nose, according to the one photograph I have of you, taken when you were around 7. I'm glad you have it. It's not a bad nose. Your father Gerald, the account balance was $214,000. I sat in that meeting room for a long time. Patrick Okafor's fiddle leaf fig dropped a leaf at some point. I heard it hit the floor, and I sat there. I want to tell you what happened to Douglas Fairweather because I think you want to know and because I think it matters. I didn't do anything to him. I want to be clear about that. What happened to Douglas happened because of Douglas, and because of the $43,000, and because Joanne, my accountant, had kept every document, and because she had passed them to her brother-in-law, who happened to work in financial investigations. The numbered company that had received those transfers turned out not to be the only irregularity in Douglas's accounts. When CRA began looking, they found patterns that went back further than my situation, and that involved properties and contracts and expense claims that had nothing to do with me at all. The kind of thing that accumulates when a man has spent decades believing his connections make him untouchable. I heard through a former employee that the Timberwolf Golf Club membership was quietly revoked. I heard that one of his daughters, not Fiona, had stopped returning his calls. I heard that there were legal fees. I didn't hear much about Fiona. I didn't look. What I know is this: in the spring, I registered a new company, smaller than the last one, deliberately. One truck, my tools, and a business line at a Meridian branch in Timmins, where a young woman named Andrea walked me through the paperwork without once making me feel like I needed to explain myself. I hired one person in the first month. A young plumber, fresh ticket, 24 years old, the kind of kid who shows up early and asks good questions. His name is Jonah, and he reminds me of myself in a way that I find both useful and occasionally exhausting. I rented a house on the edge of town, 3 bedrooms. I don't need 3 bedrooms, but the landlord was a retired pipe fitter who recognized my license number and gave me a rate that made more sense than the 2-bedroom in the same neighborhood. I put a proper bed in my room, and I put the photograph of my parents, my mother and Gerald Arsenault, laughing at something at a lake in northwestern Ontario, in a frame on the dresser. I think about my mother a lot. I don't know how much she had told me when I was very young, what I might have absorbed and forgotten. I don't know what it cost her to keep a secret like that across a lifetime. She was a quiet woman who was very good at being present and very good at not discussing certain things, and I spent my childhood understanding that as a personality trait rather than a necessity. I would have had questions for her, many questions. I have to make peace with the fact that she answered them in her own way, which was by raising a son who could handle the answers when they eventually came, even if she wasn't there to help him through them. Gerald Arsenault worked as an electrician for 23 years in Timmins under a name I'm not going to repeat here because it was never his. He volunteered with a youth hockey program on Thursday evenings. His neighbor told Patrick that he was quiet and reliable and good with his hands and that he kept a very tidy yard. His yard backed onto a creek. Patrick said he seemed to like that. I have not changed my name back to Arsenault. I've thought about it. I may still. But Reed Callahan is also who I am. It's the name on my ticket, the name my mother used for 37 years, the name I answered to in every situation that mattered. Names accumulate meaning, and I'm not sure peeling them back serves anything except a kind of tidiness that has never been my strong suit. But I know where I come from now. I know what my father did and why he did it and what it cost him. I know that the man who raised me in the only way he knew how, by disappearing so that I could be safe, had my nose and a good sense of humor and kept a tidy yard beside a creek in Timmins. That's not nothing. In fact, when you've slept in a truck in a Canadian Tire parking lot in November, and you've lost a company and a marriage and everything, you thought you knew about yourself, and then you find out that the silence in your life was never abandonment but protection, when you find out that you were loved carefully and expensively and from a distance for your entire life. $214,000 and a photograph and a letter and a nose you recognize in the mirror is not nothing at all. It's a place to start.